My name is Roselle Scarlett, and you're listening to Twitter Spaces with Black Girl Bites. These are recordings of Twitter Spaces I've hosted where I chat with various technologists to learn about their careers. In this episode, I'm chatting with Joe, a former Twitter iOS developer who's pivoted to open source and indie development. I'm also joined by my amazing coworker, Christina, aka Film Girl. This conversation was really edifying because I got to learn a lot about Joe's perspective and what it was like being one of the early iOS developers. Let's jump into it. Also, hey Joe, thanks for joining us for Open Source Friday Twitter Space, and thanks for co-hosting with me, Christina. I'm super excited. I will just start with some of the questions. And my first question to you is introduce yourself. Who are you, Joe? What are you up to?
Those are two really deep questions. So I'm Joe Fabisevich. No one has to know how to pronounce that. I go by merge sort everywhere on the internet, just so no one has to pronounce that. Born and raised in New York, big Mets fan, love animals. And before this starts to sound like a dating profile, switch to the work stuff. I used to work at Twitter. Hopefully everyone has a decent Twitter Spaces experience. But I left there in about April. I was mostly working on what we called societal health. So my job was focused on minimizing misinformation, disinformation, abuse, harassment on Twitter. So especially trying to help people who ended up running into a lot of problems on the platform. And I'm an iOS developer by trade. But at Twitter, I got to work across all of engineering and worked with designers, product folks, social scientists, especially given the kind of problems that we were trying to fix. And honestly, it was really nice because I got to just shove my hand into a lot of what Twitter was doing around civic integrity, elections, and actually I was on this thing called the Health Review Committee, so I got to get early access to any features that Twitter was shipping, just so I can put my okay, this is okay. We have a lot of societal considerations, but for me, it was just a nice way to see everything we were doing at the company and get sneak peeks. So that was a lot of fun, and I was there for about 4 years, not 14 years, dear God. If I was there for 14 years, I don't know what I would have done. But I spent about 10 or 11 years building apps for Apple's platforms, so iOS and macOS. And before Twitter, I actually worked at about 10 startups in 9 years. And that honestly would be a whole space of its own, so we don't have to get into that. But I really love technology, especially stuff that allows me to create and innovate and build new experiences that help people be better versions of themselves, be more imaginative, more creative, and try and have a lot of fun in the process.
I love it. I loved everything about your introduction. First off, I relate to having I know my last name looks regular, but my maiden name is Bob Semple, and it has 3 B's in Bob, and everyone's like, what's your name, Bob? I'm like, listen. So when I got married, I was very excited to just switch my name to something people could pronounce. And then that's really awesome to hear about the work that you've done at Twitter and getting to see sneak peeks. And thank you for your service with making Twitter Spaces. It's one of my favorite features. So shout out to you for that.
Thank you. If you find any bugs, it's not me. It was someone else.
I will not blame you. Christina, I don't know. I'm always bad at involving other people.
Sure. Yeah, no, so Joe, we met, I don't even know how we first started talking to each other, but I feel like we've known each other because of Twitter, probably the whole time you were there, it feels like. And you were always great. I've always enjoyed following you on Twitter. We've always had great conversations. But what was it, I guess, that kind of was making your decision for you, or not making your decision for you, but what went into you making the decision to go indie? Because you did that this summer, and I know you've blogged a lot about that, but I think that's such an interesting thing to do. I've had so many friends who've made that same decision, and I've had people who've come back to more corporate stuff too. But what led to you making the decision to, after 10 startups in 9 years, that is a Twitter space in and of itself that we should have, and then 4 years at Twitter, why did you decide to break out on your own?
Yeah, it's funny you say we've met through Twitter, but we've actually never met. I feel like we've just actually talked a lot on Twitter, but I was supposed to meet you once or twice, and I got sick, then you got sick or something like that. So hopefully someday we actually meet. About indie development, though, I think about 2 years ago, I decided that the next step in my career was to work for myself. I actually used to be a consultant. I did a lot of startups. I had my own startup. And Twitter was actually an aberration for me because I had never spent more than 1 year at a company. Not because I'm not constrained and shackled by the man or whatnot, but actually a lot of what I like to do is just learn and grow. And I think that at a lot of companies, I found myself not learning and not growing much anymore pretty quickly. And one of the things that kept me at Twitter the longest was that by being able to work, especially on health, I was able to constantly be exposed to new problems, new ways of looking at the world, new things. I learned a lot about like philosophy by working at Twitter. It wasn't just a question of technology anymore. It wasn't everything wasn't good and bad and right and wrong. There were so many shades of gray. And I worked at Twitter about as long as I was able to sit around answering those questions or having new questions. And a pattern that I started to notice is that new employees would join Twitter, and through no fault of their own, they just hadn't waded through this complexity. They would ask questions in the all hands channels or places and go, why don't we do this? And when I started to have answers to it, like when the answers started to become obvious, I no longer had to think about them. I realized that my learning had plateaued. I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do at first, but I knew I didn't really want to go work for a startup, just at least not for now. I could definitely see myself going back there. And if I'm being honest, I don't think I'll ever work at a big company again. I just don't love the pace of innovation. It's very hard to build things, even at a place like Twitter, especially for two reasons. One is the technology is hard, but the other part is that you have to make sure that everything works everywhere and works around the world and doesn't harm people. And it's very hard to turn off my moral compass at this point. And so I think that I don't really want to be in that complexity anymore. Instead, though, what I realize is that the thing that I care about most around me is seeing that people can become the best versions of themselves. And so I decided to see if I can build a company that both focuses on building products that make people better, but also by sharing what I learn along the way. So that way people become better versions of themselves by following along with what I'm doing. And I have a genuine belief that there's untapped creativity in everyone. Everyone has something they can bring into the world. That's a conversation that someone may have a conversation that's enlightened them, and they can read a blog post that changes the way that they think. Or maybe there's just someone who needs a little more belief, even if it's in a small way. And I decided to see if I can fill those gaps. One thing that I've decided is my goal is to unlock people's creativity and unblock them from what most commonly gets in their way. Because I think that so many people are really close to building their own things that matter to them, things that they want to see in the world. And they're often stopped by just not only not knowing something, but the fear around not knowing something. So I'm hoping that through the writing that I'm doing, I'm sharing lessons over. My website is build.ms, which very surprised to find out is not owned by Microsoft. But the lessons that I'm sharing over there are not only about engineering, but they're also about product development, design, marketing, all the constituent parts of building something, building products, building a business, the meaningful things that I learned in the process of building my own business. And I'm hoping that actually opens up the door for someone else, because selfishly, I want to see more amazing products in the world. So that way, while I'm on this earth, I get to experience them, and ones that are not only amazing and built for tons of people, but they're ethically built. And that way my life gets better by sharing what I learned.
Yes, I love that. I love that you're essentially learning and building in public with your build.ms website. And also, I thought that was a Microsoft. Now I'm looking at the banner and it says the MS stands for merge sort. But I really did think, I was like, oh, Microsoft gave him a domain or something. Oh my God.
I
But
was surprised too, to be honest. I have to just interject. Because I know that aka.ms is like Microsoft's internal URL shortener. And I was like shocked that build.ms, especially since Microsoft has the build conference. Well done during that. And I guess like bad job, whoever's responsible for registering things at Microsoft.
I have to give credit to my girlfriend on that one, because she saw the domain and was like, why don't you get that? And I was like, no, everyone will think I'm Microsoft. And I was like, and she was like, oh. And then I thought about it for a little bit more, and then I made a joke. I was like, I could just put the MS stands for merge sort in my banner, and then ran with that.
I love it. That's so cool. Yeah, that I think it's good though, because then people will like, I think it'll increase the traffic to your blog post, maybe even. Cool. I really loved everything that you said. I'm actually now curious too, like, how did you get your start into open source? Like, I'm always curious about that, because I discovered or I started contributing to open source for the first time last year, August 2021. And I always want to learn more about like how did people get their start into open source, because it was not something that I had initially considered. But as I talk to people, some people are like, oh, I've been contributing to open source since I was like 10. Or some people are like, I found out about it in college after using like this Linux product.
I don't think I can recall a very specific start to it, like a first interaction. But I remember early in the days of iOS, there wasn't actually much of an open source community. And I think the biggest reason for that was that there wasn't like a dependency manager. We had around iOS 4, CocoaPods launched, and that was modeled after Ruby's bundler. But we never had this like NPM style thing where the entire web depends on NPM. And without many of those early open source contributions, though, I remember when that started happening, there was just a burst of creativity in the iOS community now that people were able to start sharing. And I remember thinking that I someday wanted to do that. And I didn't realize it was just a matter of packaging up some files. And I have some very in the style of like inside out core memories of seeing that, going through people's directories and seeing that all of these projects were just a few files with a pod file, which is the equivalent of the package.json. And I just then decided, oh, wait, I want to build this. And when I started doing it, I realized that my code was not as modular as I wanted it to be, because it wouldn't work in an open source library. Because like a lot of open source libraries, people just dump everything that they know. But once you start actually doing open source in a manner of thinking in open source, you start to build more thoughtful, more modular code that has to work for more people. And I just, after that point, I realized I could do this too. And if I'm being honest, without many of the early open source contributions in the iOS community, I never would have grown as a product designer. So I'm like a developer naturally, but I also love building products. And those open source contributions, the projects that I got to use, made my apps look really professional in a way that I couldn't have done myself when I was just getting started. And so I don't 100% remember the first kind of thing that I did in open source, but I remember how much open source meant to me when I was just getting started.
Yes, I love that it's had that influence and impact over you, that you were able to learn how to be a better product designer and engineer from these other open source projects. And then it inspired you to be like, you know what, I'm gonna create my own open source project and learn more about making it modular and easier for people to use. Just so people in the audience know, I pinned a couple of tweets. So one is your blog post, which is really good. So I would encourage people to check it out. And then the other is this thread that I'm like trying to read at the same time as listen. Maybe not the best idea, but it looked really interesting. So I was like,
Thank you.
ooh. But basically he's talking about his journey into building bodega and boutique, which we'll learn more about soon. And I also want to encourage the audience to, if you have questions or comments that you want to contribute and join in the conversation, feel free to press the little mic on the left-hand corner that says request to speak. And feel free to come up on stage and talk to us, or leave a question or comment on the Twitter thread if you're a little bit more shy. But I don't like when I'm the only one speaking, or if it's just the two of us only speaking and it feels like we're talking at you, or the three of us, sorry. And it feels like we're talking at you rather than a whole conversation. Okay, now that my little rant that nobody cares about is over, I actually have another question on, before we get into boutique and stuff like that. Like, how did you get into tech in general? So we talked about like you making boutique, and then also like your experience with open source. But what was your journey into technology?
Yeah, actually, I have a traditional and a non-traditional background, let's say. So I do have a computer science degree, but I took a pretty non-traditional path in my career. I think in my junior year, I became a commuter student, and I was driving about 120 miles a day between like home and college. I was living in Queens, New York, and I was commuting out to Long Island. And the timing couldn't have been worse, because I decided to get an internship, and I found a programming job about 5 miles off campus. So when I decided to move off campus, I was like, okay, I'll only drive in 3 days a week and I'll carpool. So I'll only be driving 1 or 2 days a week with my friend. And then about 2 days later, I got a job 5 miles off campus, but I couldn't go back to living on campus. So I ended up driving nonstop. But I actually had this internship building an iOS app. And it was really funny because when I resigned, I gave like a 2 weeks notice. And then they told me like, oh, Joe, you're an intern. You don't have to give a 2 weeks notice, even though I've been working there for 2 years. And I was the only person building their iOS app. So I think I took it pretty seriously. Their business fell apart, not because of me, but I'm not saying not because of me. No, it really wasn't because of me. But I do think that I started working on their iOS app and I was working at the same time on my own side project app, which was in retrospect super cool. It was like, I don't know if anyone's a baseball fan, but if you know that there's like the strike zone, I started building heat maps for basically how well pitchers performed and hitters hit in certain parts of the strike zone. And it was based off of data that my friend had gotten me from Bloomberg Sports because he was working there and he was like, okay, don't tell anyone, but this data fell off of a truck. And so I was able to build those heat maps and they were locally embedded in the app. And then the next year I learned how to like actually use a server and update those files every day and all that kind of stuff. And so I was doing this internship and I was doing my own indie work, but also because it was like 2009, 2010, I was the only iOS developer that a lot of people knew. And so I had done an internship at the Bank of New York at about a year earlier. And so one of the guys was like, Joe, you're an iOS developer. I have an iOS job for you. And they asked me to build an app. And it turns out, not the Bank of New York, but it was another financial institution. It was like one of the 10 biggest financial institutions. But because I was making $25 an hour, which as a college student, I had no problems with, but I was making $25 an hour, I didn't know what to charge, not knowing that contractors charge a lot more. This giant, like, behemoth of a bank, I was like, yeah, I charge $25 an hour. I don't know if you can afford that. And so they ended up paying me $25 an hour until I was like, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. I'm in school. I'm doing 50, 60 hours a week of work. I don't know what to do. And I said, what? If they'll double my pay to $50 an hour, I'll do it. And then I asked them, can I have double this? And they were like, yeah, we don't care. Sure. I ended up getting paid like $50 an hour for a couple more months to finish the app. And then about 2 days out of college, because I had 3 apps under my belt, I was hired into a startup. And it was actually, that's where I learned about product development in the first place. And because I was like, anxiety is not good, but it sure is good if you are a perfectionist and want and have a lot of imposter syndrome. It sure gets you far. So when I was doing that commute between Stony Brook and Queens, I was listening to nonstop podcasts, and I actually would credit more of what I learned. So this is back in the days of Twit, which I'm sure Christina will remember. There was this podcast called Security Now, and the Security Now podcast had these series talking about everything from like how networking works to computer architecture to how HTTP works. And I listened to probably 500 episodes of Security Now on this drive back and forth, 120 miles a day. And I learned more in that time than I did in my time in sitting in computer science classes. And so that's why I say I do have a traditional computer science degree, but I also have a bunch of C pluses in those classes. So I don't think I learned that much. I think I learned a lot more actually doing projects, learning every way I could and I'm actually just not a good student. Like, I think I'm very smart and I think that I can learn really well, but sitting in a classroom is just not the medium and modality for me. And so, yeah, my career ended up being me doing a lot of startups, a lot of work, a lot of basically learning as I went. And then here I am.
What amazing exposure you got at an early part of your career, like even being one of the only iOS developers that people knew. And man, that bank, I'm upset that they were lowballing you. Like,
I
when you
know.
said $25, they should have been like, no, we will give you more. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Honestly, yeah.
100%. Yeah,
And
even 50, this was way low, right?
Yeah.
honestly, in retrospect, I realized that, oh, wait, I was like one of probably hundreds, if not low thousands of iOS developers in New York City or in even within
Yes.
hundreds of miles. And I should have been charging. I talked to people who were like, I made a fart app and I got paid $500 an hour. And so I definitely was not charging enough, even though I didn't have the skills.
But I think that this is what I think is so interesting about what you're just saying in your story is that we're getting in on something as it was happening, as it was developing, even when you were talking about kind of your exposure to open source and Cocoa Pods and some of the early open sourced iOS things. Like it's hard to think about it now because we're 15 years into the iPhone and 14 years into the App Store. But in like the 2009, 2010, this was still a really early area. Like people who were dedicated to building mobile apps, it was still pretty nascent. And a lot of companies, big and small, were trying to figure out, like, what do we do? Should we build a web app? Should we make it native? What devices do we support? And the fact that you were already experimenting and building these apps and doing this stuff and trying to figure out the problems yourself, I think, really probably gave you a lot of really good experience, but B, and a lot of lessons that you learned, but B, like, really did set you apart from others because you were able to get in really early, which I think is really awesome.
Yeah, there's something I actually didn't consider until a few years ago when Swift UI came out, was that I immediately took to learning Swift UI, even though it was brand new. And now we're about 3 and change years into Swift UI's existence, and a lot of people are only getting started now. And it's not to say that I was like on the bleeding edge, because I'm usually not like the first person, but there's so much power to being in the 80th, 90th percentile of people, because most people are just not there yet. But if you're ahead of the curve, you probably stand to make a lot of money in your career. You probably stand to grow a lot faster than people. There are a lot of advantages to not necessarily being the first mover, but being an early mover. And if you're actually not the first mover, if you're an early mover who's not the first mover, you actually get to learn off a lot of the mistakes of the first movers. And that's something that I constantly do. I'm happy to pester people as long as they want and are okay with it. But I'm happy to ask questions. And usually the people who are learning, the first people learning something, they want to teach. And so I'm always happy to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you're exactly right. Like, I think that being like the very first is not always great, because sometimes that can backfire and sometimes you can be too early. But I think if you're early, I think you're dead on. And that not just with like frameworks like Swift UI, but even various JavaScript things, like people who are really early onto React to this day are still some of the leaders, many of them. Same with Node, right? You see some of the same people that persisted and that have built these careers. And so I think that's really good advice. Not to say that something is established, you can't still learn it and join into it. But if you have an inkling for something and you see it as it's starting out, there are definite advantages to being one of those earlier movers, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's really just a matter of following your passion. Because if your passion is to use something that's already exists, you know how to use it, and it helps you build products, that's great. If your passion is to be the first person, I always say that if I were to do college over again, like, I'm not the kind of person who wants to go get a PhD. I don't want to be the world's foremost leading expert on something. But there are lots of people who do want to get those advanced degrees and know everything there is to know about a very specific thing. So it's really just about following what makes you learn best and what resonates with you most.
I also think it's impressive that it seems like you knew that at a young age and your curiosity accelerated your career. Because I don't know a lot of 20-year-olds that will be like listening to a podcast called Security Now and working at a software engineering company and stuff like that. So I think that part is also impressive.
I will say that a lot of therapy has shown me that was just pure anxiety guiding me to have to know a lot of what I'm saying. I need to know this, otherwise I will fall behind. I don't recommend it.
I can relate to an extent. I also have a traditional/non-traditional background where I have a computer science degree, but I went to a coding boot camp first. And then after the coding boot camp and I started a job, I was like, I don't think I know everything, so I'm going to sign up for college. And then I was like, college is not as good as I thought it was going to be.
I know. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I know you're interviewing me, but how did that change the way that you learned?
You're saying attending college?
Going, a different path of what did college, you said obviously like college didn't stick with you the way you wanted it to. It wasn't as good as you thought, but what did you think you got out of going back to college as opposed to going into the industry once you went through a boot camp?
Yeah, no, so I went to the boot camp, I went into industry, and then I did college at the same time. I think it gave me more context around like data structures and algorithms. Like, it made me realize what was going on a little bit more at my job. They were like introducing like a bag data structure, and I was like, wait a minute, my job has that. I didn't realize that was a data structure. I thought people were just calling it a bag. So it gave me a little bit more context as to things were being built the way they were. And I think the computer architecture class I took as well helped me a little bit more. So it made me more knowledgeable to an extent, but at the same time, there were some classes that I was like, I do not need to be here.
That's how I felt about all my college classes, but the answer was I really probably should have been there.
I get you. But look at where you are now. Okay, so we are almost 30 minutes in, and I didn't get a chance to ask you enough about boutique and bodega. So could you please share with us, your background and story was so interesting. I think that's why. But could you please share with us a little bit about what is boutique? And then afterwards, tell us a little bit about what bodega is.
Yeah, so I'll try and make it as quick as possible to not spend as much time. But
No,
so,
don't go ahead.
okay, then I'll give you the long version. Boutique is, I consider it a magical little library because what it does is lets you build Swift UI Kit and AppKit apps in the same way that you currently build your apps, but it gives you a fully offline, real-time updating app with a single source of truth. And the reason that your code is going to look almost exactly the same, it's only 2 lines of code. And so there's no actual magic under the hood happening. A lot of libraries try and use like the runtime to make it feel like you're doing the same thing. But in reality, I had this one realization around a Swift language feature called property wrappers. And property wrappers are super interesting. They're actually a lot like Java's annotations. And so what a property wrapper lets you do is compose functionality. So first I'll say that like Boutique was started out of a project that I needed or that I'm working on. It's from my indie business. And the first indie app that I'm building requires offline support. So I started building offline support into the app. And offline support, for those who aren't familiar, is using a persistence layer like a database to try and save data to the file system. So that way, when you don't have internet access, then the data is still accessible without that internet connection. And so Boutique started off with this very simple idea. Apps are represented by state that is represented by variables. Most of the data that you're interacting with, like if you're scrolling through a list of things, comes in the form of an array. So I thought about the idea of what if every time you modified an array, when you add, remove, or update data, then you would also update the data in the database. So on the web, you have this idea of throwing a caching layer in front of data. And this is actually a similar approach to what I took in Boutique. I call it a dual layered caching architecture, where the first layer, instead of being Redis or Memcached or something like that, is just the array that you're interacting with. But when you add a database to your app, when you add some sort of caching layer, all of a sudden you're building an app that is around the database. Instead of writing data to an array, you're writing it to a database, and then you're reading it from a database, and you have to modify your code to act. Your app code has to act as if there's always a database present. So if you ever want to remove the database, if you want to change something, now all of your app level code has to change as well. But that's what makes Boutique really special, is that with only one small change and 2 lines of code, you actually have an app that works completely offline. And that's where the property wrappers come into, that's where they actually start to help. In Java, you have this annotation, and in Swift, you have this term, a published property. And a published property is ostensibly a property wrapper that acts like a regular variable. But for example, in JavaScript, you have the concept of an observable. And so a published property is a variable that also vends an observable. Every time you update the value of the regular variable, you also update the observable. And so the way that you make a property, a published property, is by putting the word at published in front of it. So all property wrappers have the at in front of them, and then whatever your property wrapper's name is. And so what I decided to do was that I can create my own property wrapper called a stored property. Boutique has 2 parts. It has the store and the stored property wrapper. The store is like a front end to a database. So if you think about local storage on the web, it's just an API, and under the hood, there's a database. You never have to think about the database. You just write to local storage. And so still, your app is modeled as if you have a database, which is where the stored property wrapper comes in. If you put at stored in front of an array, all of a sudden your array is storing data offline. So in a Swift UI app or an AppKit app or a UIKit app, you use these stored properties around your app. So you have, var animals as an array of animals. Instead, you would have var stored animals is an array of animals that is stored, and everything is written automatically offline. I just realized I said a lot of code things. So if there's something that you didn't follow, please tell me and I can stop and start again about Bottega.
I think it sounds genius, and let me make sure that I understand what is going on. So basically you saw that like in web development we use like local storage and caching to easily do like storage, like offline storage, and then you're like, what if I just add the property name storage in front of an array and it'll behave similarly, it'll create that abstraction where the developer doesn't have to necessarily interact directly with the database, but it's storing it in the database for them so that they can work offline. I hope that I'm summarizing it. Feel free to correct me.
No, that was a lot more concise and better said than what I put together out there. And actually, just to use a metaphor, if instead in JavaScript you could do at local storage instead of writing to the local storage, and it would do all of the database stuff for you under the hood, that would be exactly how it works in Boutique. I probably could have said one sentence like that.
Genius. No, I think
cool.
all the words were helpful. Go ahead, Christina. I'm sorry.
No, I was just wanting to comment. I think it's so cool and just like a really good idea, and I just wanted to comment on that. That's all.
No, thank you. Yeah, and I think the biggest thing for me was that in Swift UI, we haven't really decided on what a good architecture looks like, but using just regular objects and regular views is the kind of thing that Apple pushes you towards right now, which is actually really great. It's really great for building Swift UI apps. But the second you have to start thinking about either sharing state or when you have to start thinking about how to make data that interacts with multiple views, that's where it falls apart. And so in Redux, there's the concept of a store. And that's where I got the idea from. I thought about how Redux, we actually have an implementation called the composable architecture on iOS. But one problem with it is that you have to buy in completely. And the key insight for me was, how can I do this in a way where my app code doesn't have to change? I don't have to write an app that is a composable architecture app. I can just write my regular SwiftUI app, which writing SwiftUI already feels fun and really nice, but I want to be able to get all of these benefits. And basically what I'm doing is shoving all of the benefits into this one property wrapper.
Genius. Like, that's so smart. Okay, so what is it? Is Bodega similar to it? And I just realized that you named these boutique and bodega because they store data.
That's right, the stores.
Yeah, so how is Bodega different from this?
Yeah, so Bodega can work without Boutique, but Boutique can't work without Bodega. Boutique is almost like a specialized architecture built atop Bodega. And by that, Bodega is where all the storing is happening. There's the concept of a storage engine, which, just like local storage, represents how data is stored. In other languages, you would probably call this an adapter pattern. And so you can build a whole bunch of different adapters depending on how you want to store the data. So there are two storage engines built into Boutique or into Bodega. There's the SQLite storage engine and the disk storage engine. The disk storage engine stores data by saving files to a disk. And that was actually how Boutique V1 and Bodega V1 were built. There was no option to choose your own storage engine. And then I was starting to run into some performance issues using files at about like a couple thousand objects. And someone said, you should try SQLite. And I said, like, is that complex? And within an hour, I had a prototype up and running. And I was like, oh, snap, this is actually really good. It takes no work. SQLite is incredible. It's super tested. I think it has over 25 million lines of tests, not code. And it's just amazing. And so I built this second different storage engine, but I didn't want to leave people who had started the project without recourse. Like, I didn't want them to have to lose all their data in this migration. And I realized, wait, what if I built an abstraction called the storage engine? And the first storage engine would be the disk storage engine, and the second one would be SQLite storage engine. And then I saw how just easy that was, and I realized, wait, anyone can build their own storage engine if they want. And then I reoriented Boutique to work directly with these storage engines. So a common database that people use on Apple platforms is called Core Data. And now you'd be able to build a core data storage engine. Or if your app is already using a storage or is using a different database like Realm, you would be able to build a Realm storage engine as well. And then actually, like, I started to get a little wild and I realized, wait, this storage engine just represents it's just a protocol that represents asynchronous data because most database queries are asynchronous. And so you can even hook up your API or CloudKit or something remote to power a storage engine. And so you can actually build a SwiftUI app or a UIKit or AppKit that caches all your data by composing two storage engines, like this remote API server storage engine and maybe like an SQLite storage engine. And this is all happening in Bodega. So the storage engine is the biggest feature of V2, but because Boutique uses the storage engines from Bodega, it's also the biggest feature of Boutique V2.
Wow, that's really interesting. I did not know SQLite had 28. You said 28 million lines of tests? Oh, did I?
25, but yeah,
Oh,
no, that's
25.
real.
But still, that's wow. That's crazy. And it's very interesting how like you trying out SQLite as a storage engine led to you being like, wait, there are more possibilities here. This is awesome.
Yeah.
I also love that you didn't like when you realized when you started with it, you weren't willing to leave people who'd already started using things behind. That you got into some of the support constraints a little bit that you've run into in your recent blog post, but I just wanted to comment on that. I think that was a great way of maybe added some additional engineering work, you getting a little bit crazy, but not wanting to leave anybody stranded with anything that they'd started out with. So that's my only comment. I think that's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I honestly don't know if I would have made the same decision in retrospect, but I'm glad I did.
I love it. And I want to encourage again. I know I always do this, but I just want to, if you have questions, please feel free to hop on the stage by pressing the little request mic button. If you have to be on a phone to do it, and I will bring you up on stage to chat with Joe. It's a good opportunity. Or you can write a question on in a thread to me. It looks like Ben actually said this sounds awesome. And then I'm not familiar with any of this stuff, but they wrote at just save my data var state. I think it's because I'm not an iOS developer, but maybe you understand it, Joe?
I'm not sure, but Ben, you are right. It is great.
Cool. Cool. Or maybe they were mentioning someone and maybe it didn't work. I'm not sure. Okay, cool. I have more questions for you. And I think you started to go into a little bit, but like how has working in public and building this in public and sharing your learnings in public benefited you so far?
Yeah, actually, the most straightforward way that this has helped me is people have helped me with my work. I want to give a shout out to two folks who have helped me out along the way, Dave DeLong and Ian Keene, where I would not have been able to construct the APIs that I built for this because my initial take on this was very much without the stored property wrapper. And property wrappers are they're a relatively new feature of Swift. And so in the process of building this, I've learned an inordinate amount about how they work. And so Boutique V2 has this new chained syntax where you can do like self.store.removeAll.add this, and you just keep chaining operations. And this is actually in the first version, there was like you would do self.store.add, and then there was a second parameter for invalidating cache. And that parameter was like very ugly and very, I don't know, it didn't make sense conceptually, but I had to do it to avoid some performance issues that happen around hopping across actors in an iOS or a Mac app. And Dave provided me a core insight around how to chain these operations and actually built like a prototype of it for me. And I just wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't been working in public. And Ian, who he helped me with the actual property wrappers themselves, I just honestly, the library wouldn't look the way that it had if I hadn't gotten their help, and I wouldn't gotten their help if I wasn't working in public. Also, just made me a stronger developer, and it's given me the opportunity to nerd out. If I hadn't shared this with people, I never would have built the SQLite version. My app probably would have had performance issues down the line when I started to integrate this at higher scale. And it also maybe build a better abstraction. Like the storage engine would just not have existed if I hadn't been building this in public because people wouldn't have had the need for it or people wouldn't have been using it. And I would have been satisfied with my own good, even like great in a lot of ways solution, but not like something that I'm incredibly proud of to have come up with.
I really love that. I know that some people who are not necessarily within the open source community are often nervous about open sourcing their project because they're like, now everyone will see it and all the mistakes. But it's actually, like you just said, it's an opportunity to work with people, get feedback from them, and learn how to build your project better. It'll make the final product be even better than if you were just working on it alone. I see that Ben came up to ask a question or maybe clarify the tweet since I butchered it.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, I was just being facetious there because I love this idea of leveraging Swift's property wrappers where I can just not worry about
Oh, we lost you, I think. Hello?
Just as he was complimenting me.
I know. It was sounding so good. All right, Ben, let me know when you want to speak again. All right, cool. I'll ask you a different question then until Ben gets connected again. Maybe you lost connection. Or if Christina had any comments. I see you're off mute.
Yeah. So you wrote a blog post that I think we've got it linked in the thread, but you wrote a blog post talking about some of the things you've learned, your reflections on an open source project. And one of your conclusions was that you will definitely be open sourcing things again, but you don't necessarily get a lot of you're not driven by a lot of the things that go into maintaining an open source project and some of the support things. And I wanted to know if maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think that this is something that we don't talk enough about, which is all of the additional work other than just creating the code and sharing that out there that goes into properly open sourcing something. I just wanted to know if you wanted to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd love to. And the simplest way of putting it is like, I left my job to not have a job, and now I suddenly have a job. And I just didn't like that. The truth of the matter is, I learned a lot, I grew a lot, but it doesn't, putting out knowledge and teaching people resonates with me a lot. But all the paperwork, essentially, all the project management. One of the lessons that I took away was when I make estimates, I have to double them, because the quality of work that I need to make sure that not only am I putting something out there that is good, but also bringing everyone from every perspective along so that way they can benefit is really hard. It applies to any kind of creative work. There's that saying, it's the first 80% of a project is easy. It's the second 80% that gets you. And I just found myself constantly being honestly demoralized. It was very hard, that second 80%, because I was like, this great thing exists. Why can't people just use this? And maybe it's easier for me in a visual realm because I make apps where I'm like, oh, great. I have to like think of a new feature. There's this creative loop that's always happening where I'm like, okay, if this didn't resonate with them, maybe it's a problem with onboarding. Maybe it's a problem with marketing. Maybe it's something that I can do. But the reality of open source is that it's just a matter of like constantly documenting and making sure that people can follow no matter their perspective. And it's hard work, and people are fulfilled in many different ways. And I really appreciate the way that many people took to use the product, enjoyed it, and I'm still supporting it. It's not like a thing where it's going away, but all of that extra work definitely started to take a toll on me as like an open source maintainer versus a person who put out open source, used an opportunity to teach people, and then that way they grow from the process.
Yeah, and I think that you make a great point about that. And I think this is why a lot of times we talk about the burden that is on open source maintainers, and we try to do things we can to lessen that. And I also think there are some people who really do enjoy some of that more process and whatnot, which in some ways, if your project can get big enough, then you might have other contributors who want to take on those tasks. But I appreciate you being candid about that process, because when I was reading your blog post this morning, you wrote it this week, but I didn't read it until this morning. I was just really struck by that, because it's just a topic I don't think we talk enough about. I appreciate your candidness, and also the fact that you're going to continue to support this and continue to make your things open source, but maybe have more boundaries. If I'm not is that where you think maybe about what you release, and about not having support expectations? Would that be fair?
I think I plan to open source things that come from what I made and what I need. And I don't necessarily have to, like, the creative exercise is making the thing. And that's what fulfills me and makes me happy. Tailoring it to everyone's needs and everyone's expectations, especially because I found myself at this uncanny valley of, I have some dozens of people who are using Boutique and Bodega and are really enjoying it. That's not nearly enough to like make a living or to try and take open source full time, but it is enough to like constantly be getting messages from people saying, this is so great. I can't believe I'm making iOS apps like this. I had one person message me and tell me that they built they built an app and they added caching in literally minutes. And their client came away so impressed that they got more hours under their belt. And I'm happy that like this person who I'm somewhat friends with is now making more money. I like them a lot. I would like them to be happy, but also the amount of work that I had to put into that was just a lot. And if it's not fulfilling, then it's just, I have only a certain amount of time that I want to choose what I do with it.
I really liked all of those points y'all made. It's really, I feel like in maybe almost any job, or maybe tech jobs, I don't know, it's really hard to decide between making sure you're serving your community and then also what makes you happy, finding that balance.
And actually, in having left my job, I still consider myself in a very experimental state where I've been working for 5 months for myself, and I'm not really looking to go back and do consulting work. That's a thing I know I can do. I'm not looking to get a job. I'm still trying to figure out what is the right shape of this for me. And the 3 months that I spent kind of building, maintaining, and developing this open source project were also an experiment to see, is this what will make me happy? And just because the answer was no doesn't mean that it wasn't worth it, especially because Boutique and Bodega are going to be like the underpinning of every app that I build going forward, at least for the near future. But even without that, there is a lot of value. I prototyped what my career should look like, and not all prototypes end up getting shipped to production. Dang, that was really nerdy.
No, and I think that's great. And I think if nothing else, right, like you have this, it's going to be the underpinning for the rest of the things you do, but maybe it'll also inspire other people who might want to take the time to really develop out and support a framework like this, because what you built is really audacious, right? Like it's something that obviously a lot of people have gotten used out of, but there's a lot going on with it. It's pretty complex, but it also shows, I think, what's possible. I haven't seen a lot of frameworks like this for Swift UI. I haven't seen any actually. And so seeing this, which was reminding me like a Rails for Swift UI, was really exciting. And if nothing else, I hope that this encourages other people to start thinking about creating stuff like this too, to make the process of developing and building things easier and more repeatable for others.
Yeah, and like I said, one of the things that I'm trying to do by building my own company in this very personal manner is to take the lessons that I learned, and even the things that don't work out for me, I want to make sure that other people can have some sort of positive takeaway from it. And like in the blog post, I go over 4 lessons. Like one of them is just I had to honestly double my estimates, but also here's what went right? When I got the marketing down really well, I ended up getting a lot of reach. And that's a lesson that will serve me when I ship my first app. And I also grew as a developer, but also there were side effects. The working on an open source project made me want to substitute friends and family with community. And I just learned that's not a thing that I can do. I still need that time with friends. And if someone comes into open source, they build something and they happen to see this blog post, they'll hopefully know ahead of time, like, here's what I should expect. And yeah, I'm just hoping that even in the things that don't go right, that there is a lot right taken out of, even if it's not directly applicable to me.
Awesome. I want to give Ben another chance. I was just DMing him that he can go ahead and speak again.
Hey, is this thing on?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I'm so embarrassed. But anyway, yeah. So, Joe, I just wanted to thank you. This sounds a couple of amazing frameworks, and I'm very interested because I actually work on a database product at Ditto. It's a peer-to-peer syncing framework. We are planning on open sourcing it. I'm not sure when, but at the moment it is closed source. We have like example apps that are live. I'm adding stuff to the API, and I like this idea of being very Swifty with the app. Doesn't have to think about storage. You just use a nice little property wrapper and your data goes in and out of the database without having to think about that. But on another note, I'm also an open source contributor, and I definitely feel you for all the work that goes in, and you're giving away your code for free, but I definitely appreciate seeing quality stuff being made. I can tell there's some care that went into this, and I'm very interested to check out all the stuff you've done.
Yeah, please do. You can also DM me if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to, if you want to integrate into Boutique, or if you want to build your own implementation that you use Boutique for, or even if you just want to talk about how you can do it for Ditto on its own, I'm more than happy to help.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Ben. That was so nice. We have about 8 minutes left. Like, time just flew by. I have a few last questions for you, and I always ask every guest this because I'm curious. Like, what's your prediction for the future of open source? Like, how do you envision it will evolve over time? I know it's a hard question, but I'm just curious. Like, from your perspective, what do you hope to see, and how do you hope for like open source to grow?
Yeah. Can I answer a question that's a little more wide-ranging than just open source? It does include open source, though. Okay. So this is something that I definitely want to write about, but there are some amazing people in open source who I've noticed over the last 5 years or so have started to mimic a lot of what the creator economy does. And so I have this prediction that in 5 or 10 years, we'll see a lot of what the creator economy does start to come to knowledge work in a way that we just recognize it, the way that a lot of creators are people in fashion and comedy, they're professional reviewers, And people are willing to either pay them directly or through watch their content and provide them ad money. I think that in knowledge work, we have a lot of, and by knowledge work, not only development, design, anything that someone does, ostensibly creating a product through thinking and then converting it into something that people get to use tangibly. I don't know, like everyone knows Cassidy Williams, or I should say the three of us at least know Cassidy Williams. She's amazing at this, but there are people who are like out there writing, example is like a technical book, right? They'll write a book and the book costs $30 and the person on the receiving end derives like $300 worth of career value. So they are more than willing to make that trade because they, especially people in tech, they have some disposable income, but the disposable income is constantly used on self-improvement, like what's required to be a software engineer. And so that money goes into the pockets of creators directly. We feel this personal connection the way that you do in the creator economy, where people want to help these people survive and also build a livelihood and then continue making this amazing content that makes their lives better. And I think a lot of these people reside in open source. And the reason that they are in open source is because open source provides a way to show your worth, the value that you're creating in a very transparent manner. And there's a second part to this, which is like, how will we choose the people who we want to give our money to? And like you mentioned earlier, Christina, React, like Dan Abramov is an amazing contributor to React. He's incredibly smart. There's a lot of social proof attached to what he says because of his amazing contributions. But it's also afforded him the opportunity to independently make money in a way that wasn't ever possible before. And so I think that we see, these are like inklings. These are like the creme de la creme, the smartest people who are finding ways to make money. But I think it's going to become more commonplace, whether it's through sponsorships, books, blog posts, videos, things that you can directly give, that you can create content and then get some sort of compensation for. The job, you will work in open source and you will build a following, right? You'll say, oh, I contribute to all these things. And so now all of a sudden there's proof that I am worth listening to. So you build this audience. And then people in exchange will say, okay, I want to provide you money for whatever your knowledge is because I'm trying to better myself. I'm trying to create my own career path. And while I don't think this is going to be a career path for everyone, I do think that it will definitely work for a lot of exceptional people who take control of their own lives because they're aligning the incentives of bettering others. And the virtuous feedback loop is that then they get compensated for it. And I really expect to see a lot of that in open source over the next few years, especially since right now the open source economic system is broken. It's either please sponsor me, which also, if anyone wants to sponsor me, go ahead. But it's please sponsor me and give me money out of the goodness of your heart or for some project that you made. But the amount of money that goes in, doesn't nearly match the amount of money or the amount of economic value that's output by open source. And we see that, I don't know, Amazon will copy a product and all of a sudden that product that was an open source project originally is now worth significantly more. And so we know that there's this like mismatch. And so I just keep thinking about how those gaps are going to close over the next few years.
That was well said. I definitely can see it moving or see our careers in open source, software engineering, developer advocacy moving to more of a creator economy. I'm looking for your sponsor link right now so I can pin it to the Twitter space. And Alyssa, I hope I'm saying your name, they requested to speak. So go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you for having me. It is Nelisa. You said it right the first time. I wanted to say thank you, Joe, for all that you do because I think accessibility is the most important thing right now. I think luxury is dead and now it's like the public sector is the economy, truthfully. And if you want to expand and internationalize, you truly do need to look at this open source model. I think that I work with inner city youth. So I work with youth throughout Miami-Dade County, and I've been working in this space for the past 10 years. And during the pandemic, I had to shift all of my programming online because a lot of these kids don't have access to internet or secure. They're become iZombies and they're just focused on their phones because they've never been taught how to utilize it for good. And so I think that accessing, giving them an easy way, because I think everyone gets really caught up in the technical of everything. And then you're like, oh, I don't understand this, so I'm not good at it. Let me go away, right, from this space. But focusing on creating accessibility. And when I did transition all of these kids online to Zoom basically every day, I had to really make it, I learned that there's 4 ways to access information. You have iOS, Android, web, and mobile, essentially. And when we would share data and transfer the data and have them access, we would face nightmares across the board. So we'd have to come up with really unique ways. So I wanted to say thank you, first of all, and I would really be interested in continuing like what you're doing to try to simplify it and connect it to students entering in STEAM and all other jobs across the board.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. I actually have a whole other section or a whole other thought on a lot of apps, and software will go local first, but I know we don't have time for that. So hopefully, though, that will make a lot in the future technology more accessible and easier to use, because all of your data will be local, and then the cloud will just be this place that do.
Thanks, y'all. This was awesome. I like the comments that people brought up. I always am grateful to any audience member who comes up and requests to speak, because I know sometimes it can be a little bit scary, but it does make the conversation more colorful because they're thinking of things I haven't. We reached 2:00, so I want to give Joe and Christina and anybody else a second to say any last words, anything they want to plug, anything you want to leave the audience with. Or the listener.
Thank you for hosting this space, both of you, the hosts and the speakers, because just having these dialogue sessions is like the solution. It's game changing to build real human relationships so that we are able to really bridge the big gaps. I think everybody's in the same space where we're like isolated. So thank you both and all of you for just being a part of it, even the listeners, because it gives us ideas across the board. So thank you.
And thank you for listening. Thank you for asking questions and contributing to the conversation and saying that, because we are all in this together. I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. And thank you, Roselle, as always, for hosting these things. And Joe, thanks for agreeing to come on and talk about this. And thanks for being so open about your journey with indie stuff. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'll make a quick plug. I think plugging me would be
smart. I was gonna say, plug your stuff. Tell everybody where to go and subscribe, sponsor, all that. Give everybody all the details.
Yeah, I'm me. I'm MergeSort on Twitter. I tweet about things I'm reading, lessons I'm learning, development tips, the occasional hot take, and a lot of dumb jokes and puns that people seem to like. I try to not be mean on the internet. You can follow me if you like people who are not mean and are funny. Second, I'd say check out Boutique. I spent a lot of time talking about it, and I don't know. I'd hate it if you didn't give it a look. And yeah, I think actually I do have one more thing, which is I have the Twitter account at Red Panda Club. That's where my indie development company work will live. I'm also sharing a lot there, and I love red pandas. 5% of my company profits go to helping the endangered species, the red panda, get back on its feet and fighting climate change. So if you love the environment, you should follow me.
Love it. Thanks, y'all. This was really great. Again, thanks to Christina for connecting me with you. This was a really valuable connection in my mind, and I think this was a great Twitter space. Thanks for the great questions as well, Christina, that you contributed. And then thanks, Joe, for being vulnerable and open to sharing more about your company. I would really love to have you on a Twitch stream so that you can show off Boutique and Bodega to the rest of the world. And then also, again, thanks to the listeners. I've seen familiar faces like Eli and Kadesha and Anthony listening in. So thanks, y'all, and thanks for everyone asking questions. I'm going to end this space now. And if you're nervous about losing any of the things that I pinned, like I have them all in a thread on my Twitter account, so you can go ahead and check it back there to find Joe's blog post, to find the link to sponsor him, and I'm also going to link the Twitter account Red Panda for his indie development. All right. Oh, you're going to say something, Joe. Sorry.
I wasn't, but also I will say now, thank you so much. This was really nice, and I appreciate both you and Christina taking the time and all the work that you put into this.
Of course. Sorry, I thought I had seen like the little purple lines underneath your profile picture. All right, y'all. Bye. I'm going to press end now.
Bye.